Good evening, and welcome to A Man's Guide for Appropriate Behavior in the 21st Century. I am your host, Scot Froelich. A few quick things before we introduce our panelists here. Despite what the announcement just said, I actually want you to keep your phones out. Please keep them on silent and certainly no flash photography, but I would like you to stay engaged. You can take notes. You can live tweet. You can jot down questions. Totally okay to keep your phones out. We will have a Q&A session for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time today, so if you have something you'd like to ask, feel free to take that note on your phone, on a notepad, on your forearm, and make sure to ask it later. Since we are a little bit limited on time, I just want to make sure we spend our first 45 minutes or so with our panelists. If the content gets a little bit heavy, as it is wont to do in some of these subjects, and you need to step out for any reason, that is perfectly fine. No one here, audience or panel, is going to judge you. Just remember that the Fringe has a no re-entry policy. Finally, you may hear some terms that you're not familiar with: intersectionality, missing stairs, etc., that kind of thing. That is okay. No one is expected to know everything. We're here to learn. Feel free to jot it down and ask about that later too. Tonight we're going to discuss street and workplace harassment with our amazing guests. And so without further ado, they're going to introduce themselves to all of you. Our first is
Hi, I am Katie LaPlant. I am a 9-year carpenter, local carpenter out of St. Paul. I am pretty active in my local union. I'm the secretary of Local 322. I'm also a delegate of the local. That means I serve on the regional council, and my regional council represents 6 states in the Midwest. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, both Dakotas, Iowa, parts of Illinois, Nebraska. I also chair an organization called the Sisters in the Brotherhood, because my union is literally called the Brotherhood of the Carpenters and Joiners of America, because when it first started, it was a male organization. So the sisterhood is comprised of all females who have since joined the Brotherhood of Carpenters. So I've been doing this for the last 9 years. Before I became a carpenter, I worked at St. Mary's University in Winona, Minnesota for 6 years, which happens to be my alma mater. I worked in student activities and volunteer services, and my degree is in environmental biology. I am a proud aunt of 7 nieces and nephews. I love the Minnesota Wild. I love craft beer. I love vodka because I work with men. Thank you. I also work part-time actually at Town Hall Brewery as a waitress. Really enjoy that. And yeah, in my free time, if I ever find any, I spend that mostly with friends and family and just hanging out and doing all things Minneapolis, where I actually happen to live. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next up is Lisa.
Hi, my name is Lisa Stratton. I am an attorney. That's kind of my primary identity, it feels like, in life, especially since the Me Too movement, because I have been doing work on sexual harassment, representing individuals, sometimes groups of people, generally women, although I have represented a man in a harassment case, and have gotten involved in the last 5-10 years with policy work, trying to go to the legislature and ask for changes, and to some extent to the cities as well. Worked on getting earned sick and safe time in St. Paul, for example. And you might think, gender issue? Yes. Caregiving falls more heavily always on women, so still. So, all right, sorry, here I go, on my soapbox. But that's basically, I think, what I have to add here is that perspective as someone who's worked with victims and survivors of sexual harassment for a long, long time.
Thank you, Lisa. And last but not least, Doug Washington.
Hi, I'm Derek Washington. Most people refer to me as Duck, so you can feel free to refer to me as Duck. I am theater artist here in the Twin Cities. I'm a regular contributor to the Fringe Festival. But in a former life, I used to work for a local diversity inclusion firm that's since been bought by a big corporation out on the East Coast. But before then, we did a lot of focus on how to create inclusive environments in the workplace, places where people of various aspects of diversity could come and feel safe and bring the best of themselves to work every day. And so I did some training in regards to that. I also did some theatrical performances that helped do some illustrating of some of the practices we try to instill in workplaces, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies, locally and around the world.
Thank you, Doug. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Before we start our first question here for our panelists, I just want to take a real quick moment to say we actually had a fourth panelist for tonight. She's not here. Not because there was a scheduling conflict or she suddenly became unavailable, but because she's dealing with a harasser and a public appearance isn't the greatest idea. So we're having a discussion about this tonight, and someone who is able to provide some valuable input now cannot. So just, you don't have to, there's no real, like, you have to think this about that. It's just a thought I want you to keep in your heads as we go through our discussion tonight and how these things have genuine impact in the real world. So the first question that I have is, what is harassment? Does the definition vary by context? Is there a definitive line between harassment and assault? How do we define harassment? Who would like to go first?
Okay.
All right.
But I don't want to be legal about it, although I will tell you what the legal definition is to the extent you can make any sense out of it, because it's largely driven by case law about what judges have said over the years is and isn't harassment. And I do have a little fun game we can play at some point if there's time, where I have some of the key facts from some cases, and so we can do the is this or isn't this harassment from those cases, if anybody's interested in that little fun game.
Yes.
Wait, already?
Well, I think that would be a good idea.
Well,
that's a great idea.
okay.
We could do that to sort of get a barometer.
It's sort of, I have to admit though, it's sort of like a political purpose I have, so
That's okay.
there's a trick to this.
Oh.
Okay, let me see. So show of hands if you think this is sexual harassment, and to the point that it should be illegal. Okay, you know, you're a judge, court of law.
Oh, finally.
Then waiting, right? Okay. The supervisor grabbed, and it's like right away off the bat. The supervisor grabbed and squeezed the employee's nipple while stating, "This is a form of sexual harassment." And even though the supervisor took a towel from the employee, rubbed it on his crotch, and gave it back to the employee. Okay, those are some of your key facts. Harassment? Sexual harassment?
Yeah.
Not according to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which governs our jurisdiction. How about this one? See, it's a complete misnomer, or just crazy misunderstanding that when you do this for work is so hard to take that people feel so sensitive, like everything's harassment now, I can't do anything, when that didn't count, right? So you're pretty safe.
What was the rationale for why that wasn't regarded as harassment?
Thank you, that gets me right back to the legal definition. Harassment is unwelcome conduct based on a protected classification, so it's not just sexual. There can be harassment based on everything from religion to disability, race, obviously, and that interferes with a person's ability to do their work. But the courts, not the Supreme Court, but the lower courts, have interpreted this phrase that it has to be severe or pervasive. One of the favorite games of lawyers to say in their briefs, it has to be severe and pervasive, those of us on my side of this work, or pervasive, severe or pervasive. Because, you know, they'll try to get a case dismissed where there's a rape, and it's like, well, that wasn't pervasive, it just happened once. So that's sort of the legal, you know, it's like a kind of very abridged version of the legal definition. But what's important to understand is it isn't just sexual. It isn't just behavior that's sexual. And I think that's really important for worlds like yours, Katie, for tradeswomen, where it's going to be, we keep all the tools and we don't let you have any. It's going to be, you can't, we can't pee off the side anymore. Your fault. We hate you. Like this kind of. Yeah.
There's a definite distinction between sexual harassment and sexual, what's the other word I'm looking for?
Gender-based harassment is kind of, you can use that terminology to split them out. They're all technically legally sexual harassment, but gender-biased behavior, hostile work environment behavior.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the things that often happen in the construction trades, especially for women, is that there's always movement up for men. Like, men always are promoted to foremen, men are always promoted to superintendents. And even within the union, men are always promoted within the union to business agents. And even in the training facility, as an apprentice, you come in and you have to go to school for 4 years. And we pay for our own schooling. So out of my paycheck, I pay for our schooling. 10 cents per hour of my money goes into the schooling. And trainers, instructors are mostly men. Business agents are mostly men. And women apply for these positions. Women apply for the instructors. Women want to be foremen. Women want to be superintendents. And there's always a ceiling that gets hit for women. And there always seems to be a reason why we're not moving forward. And if you're aggressive, you're a bitch. It's a term that's often used towards us. And if
one of my clients is in the trades is called a Sue Happy Bitch, because she actually dared to go to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and file a complaint. Right.
And if you want the job bad enough, maybe you'll do something for me. So there's always a level for women in the trades that doesn't seem to be applied to the men, and I can do the job just as well, if not better, than you. And you're a white man. And the part that's really frustrating for someone like me is that I have a 4-year degree, and I also have a little bit of work towards a master's degree, which oftentimes most people in the trades don't have. And it's just like one little inch forward that I could say, well, I also have this, and I also can give you this, and I also can bring this to the table. And it's still not quite enough, because you're just not
welcome
that.
at that table, generally speaking.
Yeah. Continue.
So I reached out and was like, I feel like we should talk about this. And the reason I really wanted us to talk about it is because I can't help but notice in our news cycle, so many of these cases that become public, where people are like, well, that's not harassment, that's just flirting, that's just guys doing guys, that's just locker room talk. And I feel like when you look at legal definitions, there are some definitions of harassment, but even there, the terms tend to be very generable and very manipulable, and that there really isn't a really hardcore structure of this is harassment, this invokes this kind of a penalty. It gets really high before it's like, oh, you masturbated on somebody, that's this other kind of a penalty. But a lot of the definitions legally I find to be very vague. And I feel like if we can find more of a definition that we can enforce publicly, it might help people from being like, oh, I'm just being a dude. This isn't, how do you know this is wrong? If we're like, no, whenever you grope somebody, that's harassment if it's unconsensual. But like a lot of those things aren't in the foreground, even if it's not in the law. If it's something that we agree on as a society, I think that helps too.
And Lisa, so to sort of go off of that a little bit while we're talking about definitions, what would it take to get to a definition, or is it something that is like perpetually subjective, or how do we get there?
Well, the law actually on the subjective versus objective is it has to be both. That's what the current law is. It has to be both objectively, question in your mind, to who, objectively offensive, hostile or offensive, and subjectively be experienced as offensive, hostile or offensive to the person.
The victim.
Yeah.
Okay.
But something else you said earlier, before you said that word, you were going somewhere else though.
Well, like as a society, like Doug was saying, as a society, how do we get there? Like legally, like how do we legislatively get there to say this is what it's
That's interesting that you ask, because I just this spring worked on the federal law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is our main federal civil rights law. That's where sexual harassment comes out of the notion that sex discrimination is illegal under that law, right? Which was only there because it was put in there to kill the bill. If anyone knows that fun story. It was, brought up at the last minute as a tactic to try to kill the bill, that it would become a joke and that nobody would want to actually pass a Civil Rights Act if it said equality based on sex. So anyway, that's another little story.
Well, I know that now.
Yeah. But what was my point? Oh, legislation. It is actually, I have to say, in fairness to the courts, and it is hard to do something that's sort of this catalog definition, because there is incredible creativity out there in terms of how to make someone feel unwelcome and as if they are incompetent and they don't belong there and they're not wanted there, and or they're just seen as an object or a tool, or there for somebody's pleasure or convenience or play. But I did work on this project to try to make that Civil Rights Act, all it says is discrimination, equal treatment under the law based on sex. And so out of that has grown case law about what is and isn't sexual harassment, including, it was only the 80s where we said there's a thing called sexual harassment. That got decided and sort of put in place through as part of an interpretation of that Civil Rights Act. Well, this year we sat down, some folks around the country, and just decided this needs to actually get into the statute because it's never been in there. So we are going to write a statute that's going to say this is what sexual harassment is. And we had to go from, this is for Congress, we had to go from what it is now. We couldn't just out of whole cloth make up whatever we might want. But it was really interesting to try to, what we ended up doing was factors. Here's a bunch of factors. First of all, one of the primary principles in the law that people on the side of survivors always point to is you have to look at all the facts and circumstances. You can't just isolate. Courts like to isolate one thing that happened, say, that's not so bad, and then they take one over here, that's not so bad, what's your problem? It was just a joke. How about that they did, over here, and then, well, that's just, I can't even think. There's so many defenses. They're like, that's just the equal opportunity harasser, right? That person might have been a jerk to her, but he's a jerk to everybody, so that doesn't count. That's one of our lovely legal theories out there. So there's just ad nauseum, and there are opinions that read like that, where it's like they take every single thing and find a reason why that thing is not offensive or could not lead to a hostile environment and dismiss a case. That's how, this case got dismissed, the one I was reading. So it is hard, but you can, what we did was a list of factors that should be considered, things like how often, how serious, that's the obvious stuff. But then my proudest moment was getting in there, because this actually was introduced in Congress last year, was a power differential. The law has never said that. It's recognized it around, it's sort of, but that hasn't been explicitly part of the law. The power differential between the person doing the harassing and the person being harassed. Because that takes in so much. That takes in, then it takes in intersectionality, race and sex and whatever else, and says, the person who's got power in this environment, what they do to someone who doesn't is much more fraught. You have to look at that much more closely. I could talk all night, I'm sorry, Scott.
No, this is like awesome. So I think I'm gonna like sort of combine a couple of thoughts here, but one of the others. So we were talking about workplace harassment. We're going to talk sort of briefly about. Thank you, Doug. I love you. I do want to talk a little bit about street harassment because they're not exactly the same thing necessarily as to how people experience them, maybe, but it is something that I'd like to talk about. So I've witnessed it. I've spoken out when it's happened. It's happened to me. So we know it's a real thing, and phrases like "you'd be more attractive if you smiled" or "hey baby, come on and give me a smile" are frequently
the smiling thing. Oh my God,
right,
that's
right.
the whole thing.
And that's frequent, and that's what comes to mind for folks. But can we talk a little bit about what causes street harassment, or what do we think? Like, I don't know that any of us have ever done it before, so like maybe we're not like, well, I don't know why someone would do that, but. Is there some sort of standardized pathology here of why people do the street harassment thing? And is it different than workplace harassment? Is it the same sort of like I need to have a power dynamic or?
I know social science on the workplace side. I don't know social science on the street harassment, but I suspect it's similar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that same sense of entitlement, I think, that causes it to have anything to say about how somebody else is dressed or looks or behaves. I can tell you a couple factors that really is social science based, and I'm cheating going off of expert reports that I've had, so this is the real goods. That for workplace at least, there is not any sort of typical harasser. There's no demographic, there's no sort of traits that with a few exceptions. There is a higher propensity among people with certain beliefs, and the ones with the more propensity to harass have traditional beliefs about the proper roles for men and women, attitudes toward sexuality. So the thing I thought was so interesting about that too is that it kind of explains this thing of, but wait, that's such a nice person. Like, I know that person and they're really a good person. They'd never do that. Well, that's the piece that maybe you're not aware that person has some very traditional notions about roles of men and women and it is on some even possibly subconscious level wants those enforced or they make him feel entitled.
I mean, I don't know like specifics, but I would feel that a lot of it probably stems from not even just a belief system, but like the way the culture enforces behavior. You know, if we live in a world where, you know, people get away with things and, you know, people say, oh, that's not bad, or, oh, you're just being a boy. I feel like that's encouragement to behave badly, and that a lot of times these behaviors permeate in systems where things are allowed. You know, when we dealt a lot with our diversity and inclusion training, we would really talk about it's really hard to change individuals, but it's really like one of the best things that you can do is change the environment. If you can set an environment where we know that this isn't appropriate here, the odds of things going wrong dramatically reduce. Where if you're at a restaurant where it's like, oh, you know, slapping people on the butt is just kind of what we do. It's like, you know, like that becomes pervasive. People feel like it's normal, that's like accepted behavior, and that's not acceptable. But I think environment has a lot to do with framing bad behaviors, because I think our society in a lot of ways has told those people that it's okay.
Right. I think a lot of it also has strength in numbers, like environment combined with the strength of knowing that you have similar like-minded people standing behind you and supporting you in your behavior. So, and I'm gonna go back to construction a lot, so please forgive me for that, but
That's totally fine.
Men acting like true barbaric men in that setting because they've had permission to do so for so long. And then women being introduced to that environment throws off their system. And like you were saying, the culture is not sure how to respond right now. A perfect example I can give is that a company, a very large company in Minnesota, had a man, prolific man, who would harass women on the job site. And he would be there. He would be there, and the women knew about him, and the women would complain about him. He'd be there on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday he'd be gone, and the women would be back, and they'd be like, well, what happened to X? And they're like, oh, he went to another job site.
He got moved to another site, yep.
He went to another job site. And then the buzz around the job site would be like, well, he went to another job site because he's been bothering the women. And I was like, well, how does that actually solve the issue? It doesn't, right?
Didn't work in the Catholic Church either.
I'm trying to like not bring that up myself.
Right.
So I'm glad you did.
Except for seminar.
Right. And in the case of this gentleman, it was somewhat harmless in the view of construction, because it was just verbal harassment. It was just unwanted verbal advances but it was consistent, like unwanted conversations, unwanted statements, but it was consistent. It was every day until finally several women were going up to several foremans from different companies and saying, all right, enough is enough. And then it trickles up to it's a general contractor, one big general contractor, and then they're like, okay, he's gotta go. So that's how they solved the issue, right? So he's still empowered. Nothing happened to him because he's still empowered.
There are no real consequences.
There's no consequences. And I could say the same about street harassment, because there's no true consequences to street harassment because he's still empowered. He or she is still empowered to continue the harassing cycle until something legally, culturally, systemically changes that culture shift, wants us to make the world better in some way.
I wonder too, I think about how we raise men, to think about like what is success, I know in me growing up, like having sex was was how you became a man, or it was like someone would boast about oh, I've slept with all of these women, so on and so forth, and that forms a relationship dynamic that's not treating women as people. It's treating women as obstacles to climb, or like things to accomplish. And I think that as a general idea pervades in people having weird ideas about sex, and what sexual relationships are supposed to be.
For sure.
So actually, all of this kind of plays in a little bit to the next question, because we're talking about culture. We're talking about Shoshana Roberts is an actor in New York. She was videoed walking around New York for 10 hours in October of 2014. The video fell under scrutiny for a couple of things: racial misrepresentation, and because some viewers felt that some of the commentary was just friendly. She later received death threats for her part in the production of the video. So, two-part question here. One, is there such a thing as friendly, unwanted interactions with strangers when prompted solely by the person committing the purported harassment? And then, are we surprised that she got death threats for speaking out against harassment?
I'm not.
No.
No.
I think in regards to the first part of the question, I think if it's unsolicited, unwanted advances, I don't think there is a case where it's just being nice. You know, especially if someone says no like a single time. If like things pervasive, I don't know how anyone could say like, oh, but it's friendly, it's a compliment. And you hear that sometimes too. That seems crazy to me.
Well, with street harassment, it's just 100% objectifying. There's just nothing. There is no relationship. There's nothing. It's strangers.
Yeah.
So, I think that is just, it's all per se unwelcome.
Yeah.
What do you? I wonder if you have any examples of what did people think was just friendly.
So some of the guys were like, hey baby, good morning, you look beautiful today. And then she would keep walking and kind of ignore them. And they're like, hey, did you hear me? I said
Right.
you're beautiful.
So, yeah.
And it's like, well, that kind of ceases being friendly once he has to insist on it, right?
And it's not friendly either in the first place to
Right.
be saying, you know, oh, hey, baby, you're good. It's objectifying
Mhm.
and implying that you're there for somebody's viewing pleasure,
Right.
right? That's your primary purpose.
Sure.
I don't know. I think it's all. It's this now, but don't mishear me as, you know, this sort of like, you can't even tell someone they look nice today. No, if you have a relationship, if you are in the same workplace and you have an established relationship of comfort that you have built over time, and you say, oh, you look great today, that's a nice dress.
Right.
I mean, I like when that happens.
Right.
So it's all a matter of context.
Know your audience. That's what I always say.
Yeah.
The fact that sentence
No.
started "Hey baby" is already.
Oh
Exactly.
my god.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of side notes on that one. One is that she ended up suing the video's producers because of the fallout and how much of it came almost directly on her and not on them.
Who
Unfortunately.
was producing the video?
I didn't write the whole name in here. Last name was Roberts, but it was a New York film producer.
Oh, but who sued her?
The actress who was in
Okay.
the video. But they did, so to get back to the cultural part of this, model Nicholas Simpson did the exact same thing in Auckland, New Zealand, and received 0 such harassment.
Well, is the difference gender or is the difference the culture?
And I don't know. I unfortunately couldn't find anything that did like a qualitative follow-up on the reasoning behind that. But she was dressed similarly. They did essentially the same thing, but there just weren't people hollering at her. Now, also, there's possibly a population density issue, in that there's nowhere in New Zealand where as many people interact as there is in Manhattan. I don't know. I kind of feel like the culture probably makes a difference with that one. I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting anecdote.
I'm curious, like how it varies across the world. I know that not too long ago in France, they've actually started to not only have a law in place, but are actually enforcing a street harassment law where such behavior. Maybe I don't know where they draw their lines, but there's like a $870, I think it translates, fine for harassing a woman on the street, and seeing how that changes the culture of France, you know, and how they treat women. Would the laws or those things actually change the culture to have such fines? Would they be enforced justly across the board, or is that a fine that you only put on African Americans who
Color,
harass as
yeah.
opposed to white
Yeah.
men who harass?
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting.
So and actually we've already started talking about this a little. There are a number of resources online. There's a website called Cards Against Harassment. There's one called Stop Telling Women to Smile, and then stopstreetharassment.org. Of course, all of these things require someone going there willingly to learn about it. Duck, you already started talking about this a little bit with what they're doing in France, but what kind of cultural shift would need to take place to mitigate that kind of behavior?
I think it's the kind of thing you were talking about, how we raise kids. And we're not doing very well. Like, we haven't even, I mean, I do presentations on implicit bias, probably kind of topic that you worked on, but if you look at ads for just something as simple as children's clothing, I have, PowerPoint slides of Land's End, they're all good and hearty Midwestern brand, right? They have advertised the same jacket, like exactly, it's called the same thing, it has the same style numbers, but there's different colors for boys and girls, and the activity and the qualities they attribute to the boy for wearing it are completely different from what they attribute to the girl for wearing it. He's rough and rugged and ready, and I forget what the ones are on the slide for her, but she's the pink or purple, and it's something completely innocuous. It's definitely not rough and ready. Same jacket. So until we can, we just don't have a handle on this at all, I don't think, and so we're raising women. I was listening to a really interesting thing, an interview about, I never listened to stuff about safety, but I did, and it was fascinating because the trainer was talking about, and this is like avoiding sexual violence, that sort of thing, was talking about how in various scenarios, they were interviewing survivors as well, the survivor engaged with someone who they had a gut feeling they shouldn't, out of a sense of being rude if they didn't. And that, I think, that is such a powerful cultural thing that we do, that women are raised with that, just never ever not be nice or not be rude.
I wonder, looking at like the things people see on TV, how that reinforces this culture. Like, what would it say if Casey Affleck and Gary Oldman didn't win their Oscars? Based on their horrible behavior. What if Kavanaugh didn't end up on the Supreme Court? What if our president didn't end up becoming president because of his behavior? I think those kinds of things would send messages to to men that we're not tolerating this behavior anymore. But case after case after case, people get away with it. You get to still swim for Stanford. You get to, you get to continue your comedy tour, 3 or 4 months later.
You get to continue to work for the company.
Right.
You've been, yeah. It's interesting. So in construction, we work on contracts, and we negotiate our contracts 3 years at a time. So we just finished our negotiations for 19, 20, and 21. Part of it's our raises. So we say this is X, we want X in 19, 20, and 21. But we also change language, a lot of language. We did a big push, the sisters did a big push in our language this time that said, we need you to approach harassment on the job site the same way. And I'm gonna try to use language that hopefully you'll understand too, but the same way that you would approach safety on a job site. So every time a harassment, something happens, I want you to behave like there was a safety violation. So I'm sure everybody in the room heard about the trench ordeal that happened on Monday, right? Made the news. So OSHA's gonna come. Oh, you didn't hear? Real quick, trench came in, buried the guy from the waist down, and he was in sand for 3 hours, which is a huge OSHA violation because that just means that their trench barriers weren't up to snuff. This gentleman probably has permanent leg damage. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that, please. But this is how we want the union companies to approach harassment on the job site. We want the same attention to detail that a safety violation of that magnitude. So we don't want you to take the gentleman that's been harassing women on the job site and just shift him from job site to job site. We don't want Because what happens, in all honesty, is that we won't tell you what's been going on. We hide, women, we hide the truth. We hide the truth of what's been happening to us, because if we tell you, what do you think happens to us?
You're done.
We don't work.
Right, you don't work.
We don't work. That guy's not gonna get punished. We get punished. And as big as construction is, there are 7,000 carpenters, union carpenters in the Twin Cities area. There are 100 females. They remember me. They won't remember him. I will never work again. I promise you that. So if I tell you the story, if I go to my superintendent and tell them the story about how I was basically molested in an elevator on the job site by my coworker, I don't work. Nothing's gonna happen to him. I don't work. So that's the reality. Now with this new language in the contract, I go to them and say, this happened in the elevator, and they do nothing. I go back to my union and I say, this is what happened. My union now has a leg to stand on, and they go back to that contractor and they say, you do something about this now or we will. That is a huge step for women in the construction field. And I have to say, the carpenters do this quicker, and they do this one step before every other trade. And I feel like the carpenters are leading the pack. And I'm sure you deal with the other trades often, and I have friends in every trade, and every trade talk to me and they're like, well, how do you do this? What are you guys doing? And I'm like, you guys need to be more active in your union, because until you're more active in your union, they're not gonna do that work for you. You have to do that work for yourself. And that's the truth.
Well, it's pretty hard in a union when
Yeah.
you've got 475 guys and 2 journeywomen.
That is true.
There's that.
Yeah.
And that critical mass is so important, I think, in the scenario that you described,
Right.
where it was women in different trades, until there's enough for there to be
Right.
peers. It makes a really huge difference. There is social science on that, not just having numbers in
Oh, I'm sure.
fields where women are new.
Okay, that's amazing, and I really hope that picks up
Well, I did
steam
too.
among not just your the carpenters, but among a lot of other trades as well. Harassment is more than just ogling, as we've been talking about. There's a lot of things. So when we see handbooks about how to operate in a work environment alongside trans coworkers, people of color, all the intersectionality, these documents come from there having been cases related to the issue. What are the legalities inherent to individual workplace leaders? So say like my boss, not a very high level, not like an executive leadership team, being familiar with the laws around treating employees who aren't cishet white men. Like what are they protected by corporate, or like what is the responsibility on each person from a legal standpoint?
Individuals cannot be held liable for sexual harassment, period. It's only the company that can be held liable for sexual harassment. If you assault someone, assault and battery is something an individual can sue for as a personal injury. But
Good to know.
But the sexual harassment or any other harassment basis is only against a company and an employer. And in many states, that law doesn't even cover everyone. We're lucky in Minnesota because we have a state law that says if you have one employee, you are covered. But federal law is only if you have 15 or more employees. That's not what you asked.
No, but that's good info.
But it is because the company it could be liable. It's up to each manager, supervisor to be aware enough of what are protected categories. But the bottom line is it really is about culture change, and you shouldn't need to get a list of every possible trait that you've got to be wary about. That actually, there's new social science that some of that kind of training that's about legal compliance is actually counterproductive. It is actually harmful. So I think at this point, companies who need to train and need to do this stuff are really I actually, for the first time, feel bad for them now that I know that the training, this is just in the last 5 to 10 years that the training can be counterproductive when it's based on legal compliance. This is what you can't do. It triggers the same kind of thing as our president triggered. It's backlash.
I was really kind of amazed when I first started working in diversity training. The culture of why businesses were starting to get into it and buy into it was different than it was in the 60s, where it was like, oh, we don't want to get in trouble. We don't, we didn't really have any clients that I was aware of that were coming to us because they were in legal trouble and they needed to change their culture. We had a few clients that came to us because they got in trouble with the media. They were, a sports team that did something wrong, or a corporation that done something wrong. And like we want to make things right so we don't have this bad public image. But most of the companies that we worked with were doing so because they learned that they were more profitable when people felt comfortable in their workplace. That if they could actually have a culture that included women, that included people of different religious backgrounds, sexual orientations, races, that having all of those different things in the company made them more money. That the companies that could do that ended up making more money, which gave you a sense of leadership buy-in, even if it wasn't them tied to the morality of it, they were tied to the money of it, which was really extremely interesting to me. It gave them a better public persona. It gave them a more productive work environment. And so we very rarely had to deal with thinking don't do this because you'll get in trouble. It was more like, don't do, they would have us come in and be like, hey, this is the environment we want to have in this company, so that everyone can thrive and everyone can bring their best and the company will be more successful that way.
So do the right thing and you make more money.
Right.
That's a lesson.
It is amazing what the cost, the social and economic cost of discrimination. Just now that I've been doing this, I'm kind of old, it's 25 years or something. When I just think back over my career's worth of clients for one lawyer, the loss to these companies, they've been some of the best workers you can imagine. And sometimes that's in the workplaces that are not traditionally considered female. That can be the reason that someone is driven out. You can't show us up. God forbid. First we're going to consider you're incompetent, but then if you show that you're actually really freaking good, then we're going to drive you out because of that.
Oh, they hate that.
But just the economic cost and the effect on the person is just agonizing. But I was this and I was that and I did this and I did that, and I'd say after a while, one of my sort of standard things to say to clients is, you can't make it make sense. It's not going to make sense. It's not a good business decision. It's not logical. That's how we know it's discrimination, because it doesn't make sense at all for the bottom line, for the company's actual interests.
Okay, so we have about 11 minutes left. And I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So
do we think powerful men are getting the message with a number of powerful men that, they've engaged in egregious behavior, I know, over years before they finally get fired, like a guy like Charlie Rose. The women had to have these stories that they were telling among their friends. And now I think women, at least through the Me Too movement, are becoming empowered to speak out without losing their jobs. So is the message getting out there, and do we think it's getting to the people at your level and a lower level in the shop, where men see something bad happening to Bill O'Reilly, he gets fired because he harassed women? Is that message getting through in our society and culturally through the loss of jobs by powerful men? even though the president obviously thought he got away with it because women let him do it, as he said.
I think that things like Bill O'Reilly do have an impact, but I think for every Bill O'Reilly, there's like 8 other people who aren't in trouble.
Right.
So they have one point of like, oh crap, I gotta straighten up, but they also have like 6 or 7 more examples that are like, no, I'm okay. I'll still get this Oscar. I'll still run this company. You know.
I'm afraid the same. I think the same. I think it certainly helps to have powerful people fall, but you know, as soon as they did, I hate to be so negative, but as soon as they did, there was talk, when are they going to come back? You know, what's their re-entry strategy? How long are they going to have to stay out of commission?
But you don't hear anything about Charlie Rose anymore. I mean, it disappeared.
Yeah,
That's
but Louis
true.
C.K. is already touring.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
yeah.
So, you know, I think it has an impact. I think people are thinking about it. It's in public awareness in a way that it wasn't. I think it did raise a lot of awareness.
I mean, and it goes back to the Clarence Thomas hearings where I thought, okay, now everybody knows sexual harassment is wrong, but people are still doing it 30 years later. Powerful people didn't learn the lesson from Clarence Thomas.
Well, and Clarence Thomas is still.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It's,
right.
it's reinforcement. Carl?
My question is one of efficacy in practice. I work for an organization that has recently put in place, because of a number of very high-profile cases, a mandated reporting system within, that kind of tells me what I'm asking is.
Well, it's it's how it actually works and who it actually applies to, I think is.
Right, and it's within the employer. And like, I'm familiar with mandated reporting systems that report outside of employment structures, and I'm just kind of, is there efficacy in this? Does that actually, because that.
Doesn't that just put the ownership on the victim?
Yeah,
Well,
it's not very
anyone who
victim.
touches the case is mandated to report.
It's not very victim centered. I do think that I think probably the hardest thing for a manager is when someone comes and says, "This has happened to me, but I don't want you to do anything about it." Like that has to be the hardest. And so I think, you know, if an employer who lets managers not do anything, you know, is taking a risk if that situation goes wrong.
But it sounds like a recipe for non-report, because now we all have to tell everyone, I'm mandated to report if you disclose anything to me.
Yeah. It's all, that part is very, I mean, I have very conflicted feelings about anonymous reporting systems, which is the latest thing, you know, or systems where, I mean, I agree with certainly maintaining anonymity of the complainant if they want it, but I'm talking about systems where they say have some kind of 800 number that you can call and report something, and then the latest thing is nothing will be done, but then if somebody comes along later and reports another thing, that will somehow be tracked. Like your report won't be disclosed, won't go forward for redress unless another person comes along. There's some kind of interesting, and I can say people in my shoes who do work in this area, we aren't all of the same opinion about all of those things. Yeah. It's hard stuff.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so I have a friend who is an apprentice carpenter out on the West Coast and is having some difficulty with some of these issues, and wondering if you have any resources to point her to in specific. So she's, you know, very radical leftist and kind of wants to try and talk about some of these issues and gender issues and stuff with her coworkers, and is feeling very frustrated about that. I don't know if you have any.
Is she union?
Yes.
Oh, so the first thing I would say is see if she has a sisters group she can connect with.
And there are on the West Coast.
And most of the carpenters groups has a sisters group connected. That would be a good first start. And give her my name for sure. Okay. And I will definitely hook her up with the people she needs to be talking to. But yeah, and then the great thing about the sisters group also is that each individual area has a sisters group, but then every 3 years we meet internationally in Las Vegas. We have an international training facility, so we get to meet with all of the women in the US and Canada, and we have training and conference and speakers, and it's really just it's interesting because it's the only time you can walk on, we call it our little job site, and then we invite men to come, some of the men in our areas, and they're like, oh, this was what it feels like for you to come on to our job sites. I'm like, we're like, yeah, this is what it feels like for sure. But yeah, so she should definitely look into her sisters group out there. That would be a good first start.
And there are some nonprofits too that support women in the trades who she could consult to that I could give you to.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and a couple of things that as a non-lawyer just kind of blew my mind that Lisa said. One, that no one can be held personally liable for the kind of behavior we're talking about tonight in a workplace or on the street, and that, I mean, that seems wrong. You know, there ought to be some way for an individual to be held accountable for their own behavior.
They can lose their job, right?
But it's all dependent on the company doing the right thing.
So I mean, there can be consequences for them that are extra legal, but it seems like there ought to be some way legally to hold them accountable. And then the other thing, early on you said that a case has to be both objective and subjective, which means that if you have witnesses who considered an incident to be harassment, but the subject of the harassment doesn't agree, then it can't be.
It doesn't mean that environment can't be, like the people who say it is offensive, they have claims. You know,
Okay.
so it's not like one person thinking it's okay exempts the whole environment or something. It's not like that.
Yeah, that still struck me as, wow, that's strange.
And conversely, harassment happening to there is good case law, it's not universally applied, but that harassment happening to other people in the workplace can contribute to your hostile environment.
And I wanted to say, Katie, too, it sounds wonderful that you got that language changed, because I truly believe that in any workplace, this is a safety issue.
It is. It's a public health issue and a safety issue.
Would you transfer a faulty crane from one site to another?
Right.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you've got a good point. So when they were building the Brewers Stadium, many of you might know this story. The crane operator came in on the very, very windy day, and he said, I do not want to fly panels today. It's too windy. And they were 2 months behind, and they said, I don't care. They flew panels, and it killed two welders. So he flew, it was the you know how the roof retracts? It was the metal beams, and the welders were on 2 pockets on each side, so he was dropping the beams. They were welding the beams on each side, right?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't want to send a faulty crane operator. There was a female apprentice carpenter in California. I wrote down her name because I didn't want to forget her name, because I think she needs to be known. Audi Hicks, Fresno, California. She went to work every day and was harassed by the same guy every day. And every day she said, no, no, no. And Friday, she was walking out of the job site, and he attacked her and killed her. Murdered her on the job site. And when they investigated the job site, several of the other tradesmen said, yeah, we're not surprised. He was harassing her for weeks. And the investigators are like, why didn't you do something about it? So the International Building Trades came out with the slogan that said, be that guy. Be that guy that says something. Don't be the faulty crane. Like, be that guy. Be that guy that sees him and say something. Stop it from happening. It's really not that hard.
I really like ending on this. We're actually getting kicked out now because we're at
Yeah.
time. But be that guy. I
Be
think
that
that's
guy.
a really good